Hopefully the last video, literally just active passive immunity, vaccinations and ethics surrounding the whole thing. Should not be too long. Specification reference, as always, please just follow the Eduqas stuff. On the Eduqas website, there are a number of fantastic activities, videos, PowerPoint slides, and a few quizzes. The quiz on the vaccinations is quite a good one, so you may want to do that one. Yeah, just that you know these resources are there for you to use. Active versus passive immunity. In a nutshell, active immunity is what your own body has produced in the context of some sort of stimulation. So your own immune system has produced immunity. Passive immunity is immunity that is given to you through antibodies somehow making it into you. So the first one we'll look at in a bit more detail with the passive immunity. Let's just stick to passive for now. You can receive antibodies that have been produced by another individual or have been produced in a lab setting. You may have heard of monoclonal antibodies. That's going to come back here. Obviously, naturally as well, passive immunity is passed from mother to child, not only across the placenta, which is why vaccination campaigns sometimes focus on pregnant moms, because you've got one vaccine and two people vaccinated, but also just naturally through breast milk from mum to child. So let's start with the passive and then we'll look at the active in detail. So passive, we've got that as well as the transfer from mother to child. We have got the idea that you can get antibodies from someone who's either just recently been infected and fought a disease, a bit like during the COVID phase when you took blood transfusions from a patient who had survived COVID, did well, and then donated blood to be given to someone who is struggling with the illness, because antibodies would be in their bloodstream in the hope that that would help. But obviously, as you've got more knowledge about the illness, you can produce antibodies directly with HeLa cells. You've done that very unlimited mitosis, the idea of monoclonal antibodies and making a hybridoma. Now, you could produce antibodies against rabies. Now, the rabies vaccine, as far as I know, has to be given within 24 hours of the bite. So if somebody's bitten by an animal with a foaming mouth, get them to hospital, get them for a shot. It's also being used if you are in a faraway area and have no medical treatment other than that nearby. So in the armed forces, it's being used sometimes, but also, yeah, so literally if you're in an area where you're not having access to medical treatment and you need someone to be healed quick, so antibodies in right away, crack on with it again. Now that was for the passive ones, that and the placenta and breast milk. Now active, to stimulate active immunity, either you can expose someone to a virus or a bacteria and see what happens, or give vaccinations. Now the idea of a vaccine is that you present the body with a weakened pathogen, with the toxin or some surface protein, some spike proteins of whatever it is that you have got, which stimulates the immune system to produce a response against that particular antigen. So you present that antigen to get that particular foreign protein into the body and trigger an immune response. You should, with that, trigger the cells. So your lymphocytes, your B and your T lymphocytes should be stimulated. The humoral response, therefore, with antibodies being there, should be initiated. We should get memory cells out of that. So the antigen and different vaccines use different ways of presenting the body with the actual illness. For the HPV, you've literally just got the antigens themselves, so the surface proteins. The MMR vaccine, you get weakened strains, so it's the actual virus, but just very weakened. So you'd have children ill for a bit. They usually, if you give a child, a little child a vaccine, they're snotty and horrible and a bit feverish for the next 2-3 days. And I do mean horrible, they're grumpy as anything. Look forward to the days of being a parent, because you get that. You can plan for it a couple of days after the vaccine. You just need to be on standby for those 2 days, okay? Whooping cough is a killed inactive pathogen. So you're breeding the pathogen and then killing it off before putting it into the vaccine, or actually just the toxin itself that is being produced. So for the tetanus, you've got the toxin itself that is put into the vaccination. Now, the idea is the non-self is recognized, and the body makes its own antibodies. In the process of producing and proliferating the right B lymphocyte, you make the B plasma cells, but you also make the B memory cells, which then, if you get the right amount of time and booster injections, you can have long-term immunity. Tetanus, even as an adult, you need a top up every 10 years. So if you get a bigger scratch, a bigger injury that could potentially get infected, please make sure your vaccinations are up to date every sort of 10 years. You'll need to get a top up tetanus shot. Now, some are more effective than others. For meningitis, you will need 3 doses before you're getting a lifetime sort of vaccine effectiveness. For some of them, there are, for HPV, there used to be the 2 doses HPV, but for a lifetime protective, they've now got a 1 dose version, which works. What is it that you want to have? You want the antigen to actually cause an immune response. Now, sometimes on purpose with the antigen, you are actually injecting something inflammatory into the body to make it angry, to make the immune system angry and make it react, so that you are going to get an immune response. And you should really have only one antigenic type to have the highest success rate with those. Now that begs the question with the MMR whether that was a good combination or source or not. So having really one antigen only on the surface to allow the immune system to really build up against that one. Now, there's a whole lot of ethics surrounding vaccinations. Can you bear in mind that this PowerPoint, I've produced that before, with alterations, of course, but before the COVID crisis even came. Your syllabus was written long before COVID-19. I need to be specific, SARS-CoV-2. Okay, that's what we need to talk about. That's all been written long before then. Now, ethics with regards to vaccinations. If you've got a high enough percentage of a population vaccinated, then you get something called herd immunity. That means the virus or bacteria doesn't really have a chance to proliferate much, because the number of vaccinated people surrounding one potentially sick person it means that they're almost isolated and cannot infect new people. The big problem with this is that not everybody can be vaccinated. And for some illnesses, there is no other way of treating it but by having a vaccine beforehand. Meningitis, that's not something you want to muck about with. Hepatitis, that's not something you want to muck about with. Any bigger illness, diphtheria, you don't want to play with that. They're illnesses that just have a high mortality rate, as in kills people. So you may want to have protection against those. And newborn babies can't be vaccinated yet for some things. They're simply too young, or the elderly, or some with immune conditions where you literally cannot risk vaccinating because something may happen. Or if the spleen's not working, there's no point, because the B lymphocytes will not mature there anymore. So not everyone can be vaccinated. So therefore, having a ring around them of vaccinated people would, literally a herd of vaccinated people, would really support the more vulnerable in that context. And vaccinations have, and that's a fact, they have reduced childhood mortality so significantly. Yeah, we literally have too many humans because we've got vaccinations that work so well. And also that's got a whole societal impact if you've got vaccinated people. Okay, the whole thing kind of flows on from there. Now, there are reasons why people choose to not allow themselves to be vaccinated, or the children, against some conditions. Now, I am completely with the thought of, do we need a vaccine against something that's very, very minor and will not kill people? Do we need a vaccine against that? Compare that to illnesses that just kill. Polio, for example, the nervous system damage from that. There are conditions where I'm thinking, hold on a second, if that's the only way in which we can treat them, which is preventing from catching them, then that's what we need to do. And people do object, and justified and bear that in mind respectfully, that there might be religious objections. In the past, some vaccinations have been produced with pork proteins inside them. Obviously, if you are Muslim or if you're Jewish and you're living in a kosher or in a halal background, then having pork proteins injected into you, that's an absolute no-go. Or you may just have a preference, let nature take its course. Let's just be sick if needed to for a while. Nature will sort it out. Also, with stock market information and knowing what's going on internationally with regards to money making, and mistrust into the pharmaceutical industry has arisen. Maybe rightly so, maybe not rightly so. I'll leave that for you and your hopefully informed research. Please do not use silly sources, find good sources. And there are genuine safety fears. There are genuine safety fears from every single vaccine. There is a small proportion of people that get side effects, that get conditions from it. Every medical procedure has some sort of safety fear attached to it. And then just comes the question, where's the risk benefit analysis? Again, for you to consider. Now, if you're a large organisation like the NHS here in the UK, you may literally have to weigh off how much does it cost the NHS to treat everyone who has who has been infected and has come down with the disease, or is it more cost effective to actually produce the vaccine, buy the vaccine, and then inject the vaccine? Because that all costs money. So what is costing less overall? So on the one side, the loss of life, and on the other side, potential loss of life. If you were to really have a 1 in 2 million people lose their lives upon vaccination, that is, again, food for thought. And also, the question is, who do you then vaccinate? In the case of measles, because measles got a high R number, we'll get to that soon anyway, it's got a high infectiousness number. Vaccinations for everybody is advised. In some situations for influenza, the typical flu virus, the general advice is if you're clinically vulnerable or above a certain age. Now with the COVID vaccines, it's literally just been in the news as I'm doing this here now, what is it, 23rd of January, that as of February, only over 50s will be getting the COVID next booster into their arms. So you may want to also look up whether you yourselves had the BCG vaccine, the tuberculosis vaccine. I know I've had it in my childhood. I know my sons, because at the time we lived in central London, where there are loads of pigeons about and tuberculosis spreads that way. But also you have, we've had a family link to family abroad. And if you've got family abroad, and you might be grouped into at-risk grouping, because family from abroad may be visiting, you go visiting there and you might be catching tuberculosis still. Worldwide, it is still around, but in the meantime, it's very targeted who is still getting that vaccine and who isn't. Now, in the UK, vaccination isn't a compulsory thing. By law, the government cannot infringe on the rights of the individual. So that's one of your British what is it called, your British values. Okay, now it's not the same across the world, it's not the same across Europe, and it's a challenge for everyone working in the NHS, for healthcare workers. Again, this has been, your textbook has been printed long before the COVID crisis. Should every doctor, nurse, health worker, care home worker have every single vaccine in their arm just in case it was to help the spread of the disease? Careful, it is not necessarily only about stopping the healthcare workers themselves to get the disease, whatever it is, but also to possibly then not spread it. Now, sometimes vaccines do not protect you from spreading a disease. So careful, don't see that as a one-in-all solution. It may well not be. And parents who, okay, it becomes a big social services thing if parents refuse to have their children vaccinated. Yeah, just leave that for you, food for thought. How do different countries handle the whole vaccination thing? Problem is, you can get side effects. They're common ones. It hurts a little, you get a temperature, it aches in the arm, the joints hurt a bit. They are standard side effects to vaccines. Some of them because inflammatory substances are infected, as again, to trigger your immune system to actually react, to actually do the B cell proliferation, to get B plasma cells. Now, because sometimes side effects exist, there was a weird link that a doctor has found at the time he was a doctor. And he claimed to have found a link between the MMR vaccine, which is a combined vaccine against measles, mumps, and rubella, 3 childhood illnesses that can kill. Not always, but they can kill. And it's a high enough percentage to really actually nationally push through the vaccination. That doctor, now no longer doctor, by the way, has claimed that there's a link between that vaccine and autism developing, some sort of weird through the digestive system link it was. And it was pushed big in the media everywhere. At the time, it wasn't really social media yet. It was still just normal media going through newspapers. And vaccination rates have fallen quite significantly. There is a bit more about MMR, and I would invite you to kind of take the research a little further. The whole controversy about around that study. Measles is the worst out of those 3. I remember I got my rubella shot much later on because it causes birth defects if you were to, as a woman, be pregnant with it. But measles is one that I think we had as children, and it was not fun. Thank goodness none of us had meningitis, but I know someone down the road where their daughter had meningitis from it and then permanent brain damage from measles as a long-term thing. So these are people I know and I've grown up on the same road with. Not a fun thing. Airborne, it's a virus, it causes a rash, it causes a really high fever and can cause quite a large percentage of complications all the way to meningitis and death. Now, because we've had fewer vaccinations, there were several outbreaks. I think Swindon was one of the centrals, if I remember right. I've uploaded into the PowerPoints a number of news articles and documentaries. That one might be a good watch on the actual Dr. Wakefield, on the effect that he had. He's now no longer a doctor, which should tell you enough. Several vaccines were available for many years, but it is much more cost effective to just give them at the same time. And no link has ever, despite studies and studies, there hasn't ever been a link found for that one. Swansea, not Swindon, where literally the herd immunity then fell and you had a large outbreak. And even older people die from it. And the whole the cost problem to the NHS is a bit of an issue. Again, I'll refer you to actually downloading the PowerPoint or getting that link off the PowerPoint. Go on the Eduqas website. Sorry, WeCheckLeft's website, which is linked to the Eduqas, to have a little look there. This slide, just to finish it all off, in your textbook, I think it was printed 2016 or for the 2015 for the 16 teaching start, the emerging diseases list, the possibility of new versions of diseases coming out of the nowhere, out of the zoonotic background, out of various places. I would like to draw your attention to the bottom line. Coronaviruses were already mentioned in your textbook way back then, because already then we had infections like the SARS and MERS infections, which were coronaviruses already. So that is not new. Ebola comes back every few years. If you look up how many infections there were in the last 50 years, I think they're probably something like 60 outbreaks, smaller outbreaks here, smaller outbreaks there, and a massive one not long ago. So bear that in mind, that new viruses, new diseases will continue to be emerging. It's how do we deal with them then? That quiz you may want to do again, and that is it for the immunology unit.